Okay, so moving along here in Rudolf Steiner, we are nearing the completion of the book. This is chapter 6, Cosmic and Human Evolution, Now and in the Future. It's a short chapter of about 20 pages, and it constitutes more or less Steiner's Book of Revelation. Every guy, it begins with it follows the morphology of the Bible in a certain sense. It begins with this great creation epic that we have gone through, and now it ends with prognostications for the future development of human spiritual evolution. And what Steiner says is that we're at a point now on Earth evolution where we have seen the evolution through these post-Atlantean civilizations, where we've had, prior to Atlantis, we had the Polarian epoch, the Hyperborean epoch, the Lemurian epoch, which ended with a catastrophe of some sort, and then the Atlantean epoch, which ended with also with all sorts of weather phenomena, catastrophes. Now we're in the fifth of these post-Atlantean epochs, and we're going through 7 sub-phases within this epoch, and we're at the fifth of these 7 sub-phases. The first sub-phase being the ancient Indian civilization, as we have seen. The second sub-phase being, it's best if you imagine this as the shape of a V, with the arc descending down toward the Greco-Latin and the Christ event at the vertex. So ancient Indian, ancient Persian, the Egypto-Chaldean civilization, and then the Greco-Latin civilization at the vertex with the Christ event coming down in. And then our civilization, which is the fifth of these, going up now, is in resonance across the spikes to the Egypto-Chaldean. There's a certain resonance between what the Egyptians were trying to do in their mastery over the physical plane with their technologies, but in servitude to the astral plane, in servitude to their funerary cults. They've developed all this great technology, but only to bury their dead. So they're thinking about the dead and how the dead are going to survive, how you feed the Ka, and so forth. Whereas we, on the other hand, have picked up their kind of technical mastery. Steiner says these things not in this book, but elsewhere. We have picked up their kind of technical mastery and applied it not to funerary cults, but to the now, to the present, not to the past and the future, which the Egyptians sort of skipped, but to the present. And so it is our task to develop what we have inherited from the Greco-Latin civilization to resonate with the Egypto-Chaldean, but to do so with 2 things that the Greco-Latin civilization had that the Egypto-Chaldean civilization did not have. Number 1 is the development of the intellectual soul, and this corresponds very nicely with Gene Gebser's mental consciousness structure, which he sees coming in here. They both agree that it comes in about the time of Homer with the pre-Socratics, and then of course Plato and Aristotle. So we have an intellectual development that the Egyptians did not have, and as he says here, the Egyptians sort of existed. They had access to the super-sensible world, but in a very twilight, dusk-like, murky sense. And if you need any proof of this, all you have to do is read the pyramid texts, which are the oldest religious texts in the world that have survived. They date from 2600 BC, from the 5th dynasty pyramid of Unas, and that is the time when they are worried that the priests aren't going into the temples and magically reciting the spells orally. So they decide, well, let's carve the spells on the walls, and that way they'll be there permanently, whether the priests go in and remember to perform their rituals or not. So it's a period of social decay that gives rise to the first Egyptian writings, the pyramid texts. And I've read the pyramid texts. It's a big, thick volume, and they're very, very extraordinarily difficult to understand. But it is clear that the Egyptians are still mired in the magical consciousness structure, and they're sort of half magical, half mythical, using Gebser's terminology of the shift from the magical to the mythical to the mental. The Egyptians never achieved the mental or what Steiner calls the intellectual soul is the same thing that Gebser calls the mental consciousness structure, and they never achieved that. So if you read the world's oldest religious texts in each of these civilizations, let's say you took the Rig Veda from India, which dates from 1200 BC to 1500 BC, somewhere in there, and you read that, and I've read it, the entirety of it, the Rig Veda, and you read the pyramid texts, and then you go west and you compare the Homeric epics, which are the earliest texts to appear there that have survived, and then to the west to our Scandinavian epics, which have been preserved in the Poetic Eddas, which were written down about the year 1000. You can clearly see that there is a dramatic increase in intellectual clarity in the narratives. They slowly become disentangled from the magical consciousness structure. The Eddas and the Homeric epics are pure mythical consciousness structures now. There's no trace or hint of the magical consciousness structures anymore that we still see in both the Rig Veda and in the pyramid texts. So there is a shift now that something different has happened in between. The intellectual soul is coming into being, and the Christ event eventually takes place that separates our epoch, the fifth post-Atlantean epoch, from the Greco-Latin at the vertex and the Egypto-Chaldean that we're in resonance with. So we have developed the intellectual soul, and the other thing, of course, is the Christ event that the Egyptians did not have access to. And the Christ event, the Christ being came down from the sun and transubstantiated the earth to make ready for its transformation from a body of wisdom, as Steiner says. The earth has been built up through its various phases. The Saturn phase, when the physical body came into being, which was worked upon by spirits of will, and the sun phase, which came into being, which was worked upon by the spirits of wisdom who developed the ether body, and the moon phase of evolution, where the astral body was developed by the spirits of motion, and then the I, where the human I, the capital letter I, was developed by the spirits of form. And so we've inherited this cosmos of wisdom. And Steiner says, if you have any doubts about this, go out and examine things in nature. Examine the wisdom that has perfused trees to produce these amazing leaves. Examine the leaves. Take a bone under a microscope and examine the wisdom that has gone into the formation of all the tiny little hexagons and so forth that have gone into the construction, the elaborate woven construction of these bones. The physical world is perfused with wisdom, and that's what we've inherited. But the Christ event was meant to help us have access to Christ as a paradigm of love so that we can transform the cosmos of wisdom into a cosmos permeated by love. That's the mission and the task of this Earth phase in what will turn out to be 7 phases of cosmic evolution, at least for our solar system, as far as ours is concerned. So that is the task. So once our the fifth of the post-Atlantean civilizations, which comes into being around, you see the first stirrings of it in the Grail legends, Steiner says, and the Grail legends also contain access to initiation wisdom that is available for initiates. Between the year 1180 and 1210, the great Grail legends come into being. But by 1400, the consciousness soul has come into being, which has disentangled itself almost completely from the soul spiritual realms and is focused quite narrowly on the physical realm and mastering the physical realm, so that we have complete freedom now from spiritual forces, from gods and beings and so forth, to develop the consciousness soul and to bring freedom of the will into being, which the West has done. But now the task is to permeate all this that we've inherited from these cosmic beings with love. So that's the task of our fifth post-Atlantean civilization. And then the sixth post-Atlantean civilization, he says, elsewhere he says, I think it's in the spiritual hierarchies, he says that the sixth will be Russian, and the Russian civilization then will be in resonance with the Persian, going back up behind the Egypto-Chaldean to the Persian, in a certain sense. I'm not quite sure how. He doesn't develop that, certainly in this book. But it's interesting that that he says that the Russians are next. He agrees with Spengler on this too. Also, Spengler said that the Russian civilization was the only civilization on the planet now that is in a nascent stage. It's still in a pre-culture period that is in process of awakening to its high culture period, and that the future belongs to Russian civilization. And it's interesting, given the current state of what's happening with the melting of the ice, with the greenhouse gases that are melting the ice. In 5 centuries, it'll all be melted. All the coastal cities will be uninhabitable. But it's interesting, Russia is uniquely situated because Moscow, the cultural capital of Russia, is landlocked. It's not a coastal city. That was the whole point of building St. Petersburg, that they fought a war over, to have a coastal city, which will be underwater, of course, but not Moscow. And Moscow is uniquely situated because of its position in the center of the Eurasian continent there for an age of Atlantean flooding. And Steiner says there will be a catastrophe after the 7th, of these epochs, which will belong to another American cycle. So whatever comes about in the American, in the seventh, which will be in resonance with the ancient Indian, whatever happens there is going to take place in a vastly transformed Earth with sunken cities, and everyone having moved inland and up north, mostly probably to Canada. So whatever that American civilization is going to be like is going to be quite a bit different from the situation as it stands now. So then Steiner says, this epoch will be followed by 2 more sub-epochs of 7 culture cycles each. So, because this is the fifth of the Polarian, Hyperborean, Lemurian, Atlantean, post-Atlantean, and then within post-Atlantean, ours is the 5th after ancient Indian, Persian, Egypto-Chaldean, Greco-Latin, and then ours. So there's 2 more of these cycles to go, two more groups of 7. Everything has to be 7 per Steiner. So there's that. And then he says that what will happen now is that there are still 3 more cosmic planetary phase incarnations that are ahead of us. The Jupiter stage is next. We've gone through these 4 phases of this Saturn phase, Sun phase, Moon phase, Earth phase, and now next will be a Jupiter phase, whereby he says what will happen is that the Moon will reunite with the Earth, which of course it's not going to do. The Moon is flying away from the Earth. Eventually one day it'll be gone. But maybe he's talking about a ghost of the Moon, or an astral visage of the Moon will unite with the Earth and will unite with the Sun, and then there will be a period where there's another breakaway with a Jupiter incarnation. And he says that the current planets as they are Saturn is a reincarnation of the original old Saturn. Jupiter is never had a previous incarnation, but it's a place where spiritual beings who have a future are dwelling after the Earth phase is completed. Mars, he says, is a physical shell, a remnant of old Moon, and then Mercury contains spiritual beings, and then Venus contains spiritual beings also that will develop the Venus phase that will come after the Jupiter phase. So the Jupiter phase will take place and it will break away from the Sun again. There will be this Jupiter phase. He doesn't say that much about it. That will develop through higher spiritual aspects. He says that the only structural features he says about it is that on the Jupiter phase, the mineral world will have disappeared as it moves up into the plant world. So everything will move up a slot. Everything in Steiner for each of his epochs involves beings that have evolved upward into the next slot in the chain of being. So there will be no mineralogical aspect on Jupiter. The lowest level will be plants, and they will be completely transformed beings. They won't even remotely resemble what plants resemble today. The animal kingdom will have undergone a similar transformation, and then there will be 3 higher human kingdoms, each of varying different degrees of perfection on the Jupiter phase. And then it will, too, reunite with the Sun. And then the Venus stage will come about, but the Venus stage will take place within the Sun. Venus will not separate from the Sun, the Venus phase. It'll take place within the Sun, but there will be a group of rebels, again, who form an unredeemable moon, a breakaway moon that will orbit the Sun Venus with these evil beings. And he says these evil beings will need to be eventually transubstantiated into higher beings so that they can then be incorporated for these future evolutionary processes that will have to take place. And eventually the Vulcan phase will take place. He doesn't say anything about the Vulcan phase except to say that humans on the Vulcan phase will be entirely spiritualized beings, which is the goal of this entire cosmic process, is to transform us into these higher spiritualized beings. And so Steiner says the transformation now of the Earth is to inherit what we've inherited from the Greco-Latin, the intellectual soul and the development of the intellect, combined with thinking, feeling, and willing, and to recover knowledge of the supersensible world. This will be the task of the next epoch, the epoch, whatever it is, the Russian, I suppose, that will come after ours, that will fuse these together in a much more seamless, perfect way, so that individuals who have developed the rational structure don't just discount the magical and mythical consciousness structures, but integrate them, exactly as Gebser says in his integral consciousness structure. That is what the next great civilization that comes after ours, that will be the task, is to have a perfect balance between what we've inherited from the intellectual soul, the mastery over scientific processes and procedures. And it's almost like the wisdom body that has been natural, that for Steiner has been actually the work of these higher beings, these angelic spirits working through nature. It's almost as though human beings with their techniques, he doesn't say this, but with their techniques are taking over the role of the wisdom body with their technology. It's almost as though we're becoming as smart as the wisdom body of nature, which grows things, allows you to breathe and your heart to beat without you having to think about it. It's interesting that human technology kind of steps in and takes over that role. And so this is Steiner's sort of book of Revelation that he ends Outline of Esoteric Science with. So next we'll look at the final chapter that has some odds and ends in it, chapter number 7.